The chandelier light in the Sterling Club didn't illuminate, it interrogated. Jae Hyun-soo sat at the center of the room, the ink on a $50 million contract drying under the weight of his silent stare. Beside him, Woo Jin-ho stood like a shadow carved from granite, his eyes scanning the room with the practiced paranoia of the underworld. The deal was perfect, the investors were satisfied, but then the air in the room shifted. Jay's gaze drifted past the fine china and landed on a woman navigating the narrow gap between service stations. She wore a stained black apron over a weary white shirt, her natural coily hair pulled back with a tension that mirrored the strain in her gait. She was carrying a tray of heavy leaded crystal, her movements slow, deliberate, and pained. She was visibly, heavily pregnant. As she paused to press a hand to the small of her back, a gesture of pure unmanaged exhaustion, Jay felt the world he had built since their divorce 9 months ago turn to ash. That wasn't just a waitress, that was Zara Monroe, the woman who had told him she didn't love him anymore, the woman who was now carrying a child in a room where the appetizer cost more than her monthly rent. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Jay's penthouse, mirroring the cold fury vibrating in his chest. On the desk, a digital tablet glowed, displaying a trail of financial breadcrumbs that Jin-ho had spent the last 3 hours unearthing. Jay didn't look at the screen. He stared up the city skyline, the lights blurring into streaks of neon. The paper trail is clean on the surface, Jin-ho's voice cut through the silence, low and steady, but the destination for the monthly wire transfers is a shell company owned by Hale and Bell. They're a debt restructuring firm, but their methods are purely paramilitary. She hasn't missed a single payment, Jay. $42,000 every month for 9 months. Jay finally turned, his face a mask of porcelain hard resolve. 42,000, that's more than her annual salary at that club. How? She sold the heirloom jewelry your mother gave her. She liquidated her savings, and when that ran out, she started working 3 jobs, Jin-ho replied, sliding a photo across the desk. It was a grainy surveillance shot of Zara entering a dilapidated medical clinic in the district. She looked frail, her hand protectively cradling the swell of her stomach. She didn't leave you because she stopped loving you, Jay. Hale and Bell threatened to leak the falsify Hong Kong merger documents, the ones that would have triggered a federal RICO investigation into your family. They gave her a choice: stay with you and watch your empire burn, or leave and pay the silence tax. The air in the room felt thin, suffocating. Remembered the day she left, the coldness in her eyes, the way she had looked at him and said he was nothing but a ghost of the man she once knew. It had been a performance, a masterpiece of sacrifice. She had walked into a living hell to keep his crown on his head, and she had done it while carrying the heir to his throne. The collectors are moving tonight, Jay. Jin-ho checked his watch. She's short on the interest. They don't take excuses, and they don't care about her condition. Jake grabbed his coat, the fabric snapping in the quiet room like a gunshot. His heart, which he thought had turned to stone months ago, thundered with a terrifying protective heat. Tell the security detail to stay back. I don't want a scene until I'm inside. And if they've already laid a hand on her? Jin-ho asked, his hand hovering over his own holstered weapon. Jay's eyes were blacker than the storm outside. Then Hale and Bell will find out exactly what kind of monster they tried to protect. He stepped toward the door, the weight of 9 months of misplaced hatred shifting into a singular, lethal purpose. Let's go bring my wife home. The rain didn't just fall in this part of the city, it rotted. Jay stepped over a rusted pipe in the hallway of a cramped walk-up, the smell of damp plaster and cheap disinfectant clinging to his bespoke wool coat. When he reached apartment 4B, the door was thin enough to hear the low, rhythmic hum of a cheap space heater struggling against the draft. Inside, the 3,400 square feet of luxury he was used to had shrunk to a 340 square foot cage. A single cooking pot sat on a hot plate, the steam fogging the only window. Zara was there, her back to him, folding a tiny faded baby blanket with trembling hands. The sight of her, the curve of her spine, the exhaustion in her shoulders tore through Jay's practiced composure. The chandelier pays better than this, Zara, Jay said, his voice a low vibration in the small room. She spun around, a gasp catching in her throat. Her eyes, once full of fire, were shadowed by a fatigue that went bone deep. Jay, you shouldn't be here. You need to leave, now. I know about Hale and Bell, he said, stepping into the dim light. I know about Marcus and the debt he dropped in your lap. I know about the breach they used to choke you. Zara's breath hitched, her hand flying to the swell of her stomach. The defiance that had worn like an armor for 9 months began to fracture. I told you I didn't love you. I told you I wanted a different life. You told me the cruelest lie you could find because you knew it was the only thing that would make me sign those papers without looking back. You let me hate you so I wouldn't fight the feds. You did it to keep me out of the trap. Zara looked at the door, her terror palpable. Jay, they're coming. If they find you here, the deal's off. They'll destroy everything you've built. A heavy, rhythmic thud echoed from the hallway, the sound of steel-toed boots against rotting wood. Jay didn't flinch. He reached out, his fingers barely grazing the cold skin of her cheek. Let them come, he murmured, his eyes locking onto hers as a shadow darkened the threshold. The heavy thud against the door stopped, replaced by the muffled, low-frequency vibration of men's voices in the hallway. Jay didn't pull his hand away from Zara's cheek. He could feel the frantic, fluttering pulse in her neck. Her skin was suddenly waxen, the light from the single bulb overhead reflecting on a sheen of cold sweat that had broken across her brow. Jay, she whispered, her voice thinning into a thread of static. My head, everything is blurry. The defiance that had held her upright for 9 months finally snapped. She swayed, her hand clenching the front of his bespoke coat as she gasped for air that seemed to have turned to lead. Jay caught her before her knees hit the cracked linoleum, pulling her into the solid heat of his chest. He felt the tremor in her limbs, a violent, rhythmic shaking that had nothing to do with the cold. Zara, look at me, Jay commanded, his voice a sharp blade cutting through her rising panic. Her eyes were unfocused, the pupils blown wide as she pressed a hand to her stomach. The monitor of his own heart hammered against his ribs. He knew the signs of a body pushed past its limits. It's the pressure, she managed to choke out, her fingers digging into his arms. It won't go down. Jay didn't hesitate. He reached for his phone with one hand while keeping her anchored with the other. Gino, I need a medical transport to the North District now. Preeclampsia spike. Tell the hospital to clear the surgical floor. He hung up and dialed 911 in the same breath, his eyes never leaving hers. Listen to me, he murmured, his forehead resting against hers, forcing her to find his rhythm. The debt, the feds, Hale and Bell, it's over. You're done carrying this alone, Zara. The weight is mine now. Do you hear me? It's mine. She tried to shake her head, a single tear tracking through the dust on her face. They'll kill you, Jay. They'll take everything. Let them try, he whispered, his jaw setting into a line of lethal promise as the apartment door finally groaned under a heavy kick. The door splintered open, but Jay didn't turn around. He only tightened his hold on the woman who had sacrificed everything for him, even as the first shadow crossed the threshold. The antiseptic white of the neonatal intensive care unit was a different kind of interrogation than the chandeliers of the Sterling Club. Here, the silence was measured by the rhythmic, fragile beep of a heart monitor, a tiny synthetic pulse for a life that shouldn't have been fighting this hard yet. Jay sat in a rigid plastic chair, the expensive wool of his coat discarded for a sterile blue gown. In the center of the transparent incubator, Eli was a miracle of 4 pounds and 11 ounces, his skin like translucent silk, his chest heaving with the effort of every breath. He was so small, so impossibly delicate, that Jay feared the mere vibration of his voice might shatter the boy. He has your chin, Gino whispered, appearing in the doorway like a ghost, and Zara's stubbornness. The doctors say the next 48 hours are the bridge. Jay didn't look up. His gaze remained locked on the miniature hand curled into a defiant fist. For 9 months, he had believed his legacy was built on steel and contracts. He had been wrong. His legacy was currently tethered to a ventilator in a room that smelled of ozone and desperation. And the collectors? Jay asked, his voice a low, jagged rasp. They're waiting downstairs. They think the hospital is neutral ground. They're still demanding the arrears, Jay. They say the interest on the Hong Kong leak has doubled because you interfered. A cold, tectonic shift occurred behind Jay's eyes. He reached out, his finger barely grazing the warm plastic of the incubator. He could feel the fragility of his son under his hand, and it fueled a fury so absolute it felt like ice in his veins. To Hale and Belle, Zara and Miss Child were just entries in a ledger. To Jay, they were the only things that made the empire worth holding. There want their interest, Jay murmured, finally standing. The exhaustion of the night vanished, replaced by a predatory clarity. Tell them I'm coming down to settle the account, personally. He looked at Eli one last time, a silent promise of a father who would burn the world to keep the nursery quiet, and stepped into the hallway. The elevator doors opened with a clinical chime, revealing 3 men in dark suits waiting in the lobby. Jay didn't slow his pace. He wasn't a king tonight. He was a storm. The clinical hum of the hospital's recovery wing felt like a ticking clock. Jay stood by the window, watching the rain blur the city into a watercolor of gray and neon. Behind him, Zara lay sleeping, her breath hitching occasionally in her drug-induced haze and her hand reaching instinctively for the empty space beside her. The architecture of their threat is elegant, I'll give them that, Jinho murmured, his laptop screen casting a pale, ghostly light across the darkened room. Hale and Bell didn't just fabricate the Hong Kong breach, they mirrored it against 3 other active federal investigations. They've been using the same digital fingerprints to lean on half the board members in the district. Jay turned, his eyes as cold as the glass he had been leaning against. Then they aren't just collectors, they're a central nervous system for the city's extortion. If one tentacle is severed, the whole body reacts. Exactly, Jinho replied, his fingers flying across the keys. But they made a mistake. They used a private server in the Cayman Islands to route the silence talks from Zara's accounts. That server is currently being monitored by the FBI's Cybercrimes Division for a separate case involving the Valenti Syndicate. If we link their extortion of Zara to the Valenti laundering, they aren't just looking at a lawsuit, they're looking at a black hole. Jay leaned over the desk, the predatory clarity returning. Flip it. Don't just send the data to the feds, send a decrypted fragment of it to Hale and Bell's primary investors first. Let them see the ship is sinking before the authorities even dock. The irony wasn't lost on him. Zara had nearly died to keep him out of a federal trap, and now he was using that very same system to dismantle her tormentors. He walked back to the bed, gently tucking the blanket around her shoulders. She stirred, her eyes fluttering open for a brief, disoriented second. Jay? Are they coming? He leaned down, pressing a lingering kiss to her temple, the scent of antiseptic and her familiar jasmine filling his senses. No one is coming for you ever again, Zara. Sleep. As her eyes closed, Jay's phone vibrated in his pocket, a single message from an unknown number. The investors are panicking. They want a meeting at the docks. 1 hour. Jay didn't hesitate. He looked at his sleeping wife, then at the door where the night awaited. Jinho, get the car. It's time to show them what happens when the hunted stops running. The dawn didn't break over the city. It bled, a pale lavender light filtering through the hospital blinds to chase away the neonatal shadows. Jay sat by Zara's bedside, his suit jacket wrinkled, his tie loosened, and the predatory sharpness in his eyes replaced by a hollow, aching relief. He watched the steady rise and fall of her chest, the rhythmic beep of the monitors finally sounding like a lullaby rather than a warning. Zara's eyelids flickered, then opened. For a brief heartbeat, the old terror returned, that reflexive tightening of her jaw as she prepared to face another day of invisible chains. She looked at Jay, her voice a cracked whisper. Are you still here? You need to go before they see you. He reached out, taking her hand. His skin was cold from the morning air, but his grip was an anchor. No one is looking for me anymore, Zara, and they're not looking for you. He leaned in closer, his voice slow and steady. Jinho just confirmed it. The feds moved in at 4 a.m. The threat architecture collapsed. Hale, Bell, and their primary investors are in custody on RICO charges. The Hong Kong file, it's been flagged as a fraudulent plant. The ledger is gone. The debt is dead. Zara stared at him, her breath hitching. She waited for the punchline, for the catch, for the sound of boots in the hallway. But the only sound was the distant, peaceful hum of the hospital waking up. Slowly, the tension that lived in her marrow for 9 months began to dissolve. She let out a long, shuddering breath, the first one that didn't feel like it was being rationed. Is it really over? She asked, a single tear spilling over. It's over, Jay promised, brushing the moisture from her cheek with his thumb. He watched her face soften, the bloom of life returning to her tired features as she looked toward the NICU doors where their son was waiting. But as Jay's phone buzzed on the nightstand, his expression shifted. It wasn't Jinho. It was an encrypted image of Marcus, Zara's brother, standing at a terminal in Zurich with a suitcase Jay didn't recognize. "Jay?" Zara asked, noting the sudden stillness in his posture. He forced a smile, pocketing the phone. "Nothing, Zara, just the sun coming up." The transition from the hospital's sterile white to the Sterling Club's suffocating gold was jarring. Jay stood in the center of the grand ballroom, the scent of expensive bourbon and floor wax hanging in the stagnant air. The club was empty, the silence heavy with the ghosts of the elite who had watched a pregnant woman carry their weight without ever truly seeing her. Beside him, Zara leaned slightly against her cane, her gaze fixed at the service station where she had nearly collapsed only a week ago. She was no longer wearing the stained apron, a silk coat now draped over her shoulders, but the memory of the struggle remained etched in the way she surveyed the room, not with awe, but with a weary, knowing disdain. "I hated this place," Jay said, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "I hated every brick of it because of what it did to you while I was too blind to notice." Zara turned to him, her brow furrowing. "Then why are we here, Jay? I don't want to look at these walls. I don't want to remember the back-breaking shifts or the way the manager looked through me." Jay reached into his pocket and pulled out a single, heavy brass key. He didn't hand it to her. He held it between them like a bridge. "I bought the building this morning. Every floor, every lease, every debt attached to this address." Zara's breath hitched. "You bought it to tear it down?" "To change it," Jay corrected, his eyes locking onto hers with a fierce, quiet intensity. "I'm not giving this to you as a gift. I'm offering a partnership. I want you to gut this place, strip away the interrogation lights and the elitism, build a space that honors the invisible people, the ones who keep this city running while the kings play at their tables. Make it yours. Make it fair." Zara looked from the key to the man she had once pushed away to save. The power dynamic was shifting, the slow burn of their shared history reigniting in the ruins of their past. She reached out, her fingers brushing his as she took the key. "A partnership," she whispered, a spark of the old fire returning to her eyes. "And if I decide to fire the board first?" Jay's lips curved into a rare, dangerous smile. "I'll provide the matches." But as Zara turned to survey her new empire, Jay's gaze drifted to the grand entrance. A courier in a nondescript uniform was leaning against the doorframe, holding a black envelope addressed to the new proprietor, with Marcus's seal stamped in blood-red wax. The transition from the sterile, beeping chaos of the NICU to the hushed luxury of their new estate felt like crossing into another dimension. The house, a masterpiece of glass and warm cedar nestled against the city's edge, didn't interrogate, it protected. Jay carried the car seat as if it contained the world's most fragile glass, his knuckles white against the handle until he finally set it down on the velvet sofa. Eli was tiny, a 4-pound miracle wrapped in cashmere, but his presence filled every corner of the vast living room. Zara stood beside Jay, her hand hovering near the infant's chest, her fingers trembling with a mix of awe and the lingering phantom of fear. The invisible woman was gone, replaced by a mother whose every instinct was a raw, exposed nerve. "He's so quiet," Zara whispered, the silence of the house feeling heavy after months of hospital alarms. Jay stepped behind her, his hands resting tentatively on her shoulders. For a moment, she stiffened, the memory of their 9-month Cold War flickering in her eyes. But as the heat of his palms seeped through her silk blouse, she let out a long, shuddering breath and leaned back into him. "The machines did their job, Zara. Now it's our turn. No more ledgers, no more shadow shifts." They moved together with a clumsy, beautiful rhythm, navigating the first bath and the first feeding with the desperate focus of two people rebuilding a bridge over an abyss. When Eli finally drifted into a deep sleep, Jay led Zara to the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the darkened valley. He took her hand, his thumb tracing the space where her wedding ring used to be, a scar of skin that was starting to heal. "I'm not the man who let you walk away anymore," he said, his voice thick with a promise that went deeper than any contract. Zara looked at him, the slow burn of their shared history finally catching fire in her gaze. "I'm not the woman who ran either." She reached up, her fingers tangling in his hair, pulling him down for a kiss that tasted of salt and second chances. But as Jay's heart finally found its rhythm, a sharp rhythmic tapping echoed from the front door. Not a knock, but a code, one that only Jinho and the underworld knew. Jay's blood turned to ice as he saw a familiar silhouette through the frosted glass. Marcus, holding a black suitcase, and he wasn't alone. The velvet rope at the entrance of Round Table didn't just divide a room, it marked a border between the past and a redefined future. Gone were the interrogation lights of the Sterling Club, replaced with a warm amber glow that softened the edges of the exposed brick and dark wood. Zara moved through the space with a grace that was no longer labored. She wore a deep emerald dress that draped over her recovering frame, her natural coils crowned with a gold clip that caught the light as she laughed with the head chef, a woman who had only a month ago been washing dishes until her hands bled. The staff were the invisibles Jay had once overlooked. They moved with a pride that couldn't be bought, their dignity woven into the very fabric of the service. Jay sat at a shadowed corner table, a glass of untouched scotch in front of him. From this vantage point, he didn't see a business venture, he saw a sanctuary. He had spent his life building fortresses of steel and secrets to protect what was his, believing that power was the only shield worth holding. But watching Zara adjust a server's collar with a maternal touch, he realized his mistake. He had provided the armor, but Zara had provided the heart that made the protection mean something. She felt his gaze and wove through the crowded tables towards him. The air between them hummed, a slow-burn tension that had finally settled into a deep, rhythmic trust. "You're brooding, Mr. So," she murmured, leaning down so her scent of jasmine and expensive spice clouded his senses. "The critics are calling it the soul of the district. Does that hurt your bottom line?" Jay reached out, his hand sliding around her waist to pull her an inch closer. "My bottom line is currently sleeping in the manager's office. The rest is just noise." Zara smiled, a genuine, radiant thing that reached her eyes. "He's awake, actually. Jinho just brought him out." She stepped aside to reveal Wu Jinho, the shadow of the underworld, looking uncharacteristically soft as he held a bundled Eli. Jay took his son into his arms, the boy's weight a solid, grounding reality. As Jay looked down, Eli's tiny, stubborn hand reached out, his miniature fingers locking around Jay's index finger with a strength that defied his size. It was a grip that refused to let go, a silent, fierce claim on the man who had finally come home. Jay looked up at Zara, the weight of their journey settling into a quiet peace. But as the front door chimes rang, a man in a tailored gray suit stepped in, eyes scanning the room not for a table, but for a target. The war wasn't over, it had just changed venues.